Good evening. It's good to see everyone back again tonight. If you'd like to open to Psalm 121, we're going to be studying out of Psalm 121 this evening. And I want you, as we kind of try to get into the ideas of this psalm, to try to remember the time in your life when you were probably, I assume, very young, and a part of you believed that it was possible, at least possible, that monsters were real. Do you remember that time of life when you just weren't really sure, and then it seemed like it was very possible? I remember when I was a little kid, my grandmother, of all people, I don't know why, my grandmother would tell me these very horrifying stories of a man named Mr. Ooh who lived in our alley, apparently. This is what she said. And he would creep around at night, and he was just this horrifying monster in my mind. And I even remember one night I went to sleep, and I was, maybe, I remember this, but I was probably 3 or 4 years old, and I placed my hand above my head as I fell asleep, and the head of my bed was up against a window, and I dreamed that he had reached into the window and grabbed my hand. And of course, you know how I ran to my mother's bed and was terrified. And I think I was probably in my early 20s in college before I realized that I still was slipping my hands under the covers every night before I went to bed, and didn't even realize why I was doing it anymore. He wasn't going to grab my hand again. But remember a time when you really believed that monsters were real, and that kind of helps you to a degree to get into the mindset of the trouble that the people in ancient Israel, and specifically the people perhaps in Psalm 121 were facing. It says in Psalm 121, "I will lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence comes my help. My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth, and even forevermore." And so, when you say he looks up to the hills, to the hilltops, to the mountaintops, and really, when you think about, the contrast between valleys and hills, normally it's valleys bad, mountaintops good, right? That's the high points in life. That's the good points in life. But what do you do when you look up to the mountaintop and you find danger there? When the mountaintop itself seems to be threatening as much as the valley did below. A little while ago, we had considered Psalm 120, just the psalm right before it, which is the first psalm of the Song of Ascents, or a song of things that are, something's rising. And we talked about how it's possible that this was written by King Hezekiah as he's in sort of a looming valley, that his difficulties and his challenges, he's in a sort of a deep valley of life, probably in his youth, and he talks about, in verse 5, "Woe is me, that he feels he's dwelling so far from Jerusalem. My soul has dwelt too long with one who hates peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war." And so he's in this deep valley. In Psalm 121, he's sort of coming out of that valley and coming to the mountaintop, which should be a reason for celebration. But at the top of the mountain, he finds something that gives him great concern. He finds something that may be, in some ways, as equally dangerous as what he had found down in the valley. Now, what's on top of the mountaintops in Israel, you've probably heard and read a lot about them in the Bible, what they call the high places, where they put the idols and the poles to Asherah and the altars and the places where they worshipped false gods. And so, if you are an Israelite in ancient Israel, and you believe that there is God, but you sort of wonder if maybe there aren't also other gods, in the same way that we as children sometimes wondered, were there really monsters or things like that? Then when you look up to those mountaintops, if you're approaching one of those mountaintops, you feel concerned about the God who's supposed to be in charge of that mountain and what he does to you if you don't submit to him. And so he says in verse 1, "I will lift up my eyes to the hills." I look up to what everyone else is seeing as a source of comfort, a source of of security, those false gods on the hilltops. But he asked the question, where does my help really come from? From whence comes my help? And he says, my help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And that's really the first point that he has for us is when we are really honest with ourselves, what we find is our help, well, we have a helper, and he is the true helper because he is the creator of all things. It's very much the idea of Psalm 23 when he says, the Lord is my shepherd, and so he leads me into these still pastures. He leads me besides the green pastures and the still waters. He is providing for me. He helps me. He takes care of me. And notice in verse 2, this is a very personal help. It's not just generically God helps people. He says, my help. This is a personal help that each Christian can cry, my help, my individual help comes from the Lord. He has promised to help us, and he never fails. That's what Hebrews chapter 6 tells us. Hebrews chapter 6 and verses 17 and 18 describes how God promised to help us and how God cannot lie. And God always keeps his oaths. God always keeps his promises. And so if he can't lie and if he always keeps his promises, then he never fails. And so we can trust him. But more than that, we can trust him because in comparison to what other kind of God that they were afraid may be real, even that God could never said to be the creator God. That's what he says, my help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Maybe they believed that Baal was the god of this mountaintop. Maybe they were afraid that that was true. They weren't sure. But maybe he's the god of that mountaintop. But he didn't make the mountaintop. He didn't make the sky above the mountaintop. He didn't create all of those things. Only God can be said to be the creator of all things. And so, probably the occasion that Hezekiah would be writing this psalm would shortly follow Psalm 120. Psalm 120 seems to be taken, and it's possible that Hezekiah is not the one that wrote this, and I would never say, that that's just a for certain thing. It doesn't tell us who wrote it, and so you may find evidence that someone else wrote it, and I'll support you in that. But to me, it makes the most sense to point to Hezekiah. And we talked last time about Psalm 120 and his youth and the difficulties faced. Remember, his father was King Ahaz. King Ahaz was a wicked king who burned his children in the fires of Molech and who worshipped the Dagon, the Syrian god, and who did a lot of really terrible things, brought a lot of war, and that's what he talks about. I am for peace, verse 7 of 120, but when I speak, they are for war. He brought a lot of war to the country. But after his father died, King Hezekiah became king, and it says really on the first day of his kingship, he turned to the Levites and he said, things are going to be different now, and we're not going to worship these other gods. We're going to cleanse the Levites, we're going to cleanse the priest, and we're going to cleanse the temple, and we're going to put things back how they're supposed to be, how they were when his grandfather was reigning over Judah, King Jotham. And so Hezekiah does all those things, and then very shortly after, when all the people had gathered in Jerusalem for the first Passover feast that had been celebrated in a long time, he took the opportunity to say, let's really make this official. Let's climb to the top of the hilltops, not just in Judah, but in all the surrounding country. They even went into Ephraim and Manasseh. And you know what that means? They went into the territory of the other king, the king of Israel. And they went and they destroyed the altars and the idols on top of the mountaintops. And so you can imagine if you were maybe from Manasseh or Ephraim, from the northern kingdom, and you hear the call. Hezekiah wrote a letter and he sent it out all over the place. Come worship with us. Come celebrate the Passover. Come worship God the way we're supposed to be all along. If you had lived up there and then you came down to Judah, right, so you know what that means. You have to pass. You have to pass the golden calves that had been set up. Do you remember how Jeroboam set up the golden calves that they had worshipped in place of God, that they worshipped instead of coming to Jerusalem to try to keep some distinction there? So you have to go through all of the people who think you're a fool for coming to Jerusalem. You have to walk past the golden calves. You have to keep on going to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover with Hezekiah. And then he says, now, let's go back to where you're from, and let's climb up those mountains, and let's tear down those idols. Do you remember how Gideon was afraid to do that? Gideon didn't want to go to his own father's house and tear down the idol that his father was worshiping. And that's what Hezekiah is asking these people to do. And so you can imagine that even if all they're afraid of is their neighbors, that's a pretty unpleasant sounding task, right? My neighbors are going to be mad at me if I tear down their favorite idol. That's going to be a problem no matter what. But what if you're also just uncertain, is that a real God or not? He's not Yahweh, but he could be real, because it's very evident through all of the Old Testament that the Israelites really struggled with this. Are those real gods or not? And that's, even when they go into the land, Joshua says, put away your idols. Even at the end of Joshua's life, he says again, put away your idols. All that time they've been conquering the Canaan land, and they still have their idols with them. They're still worshiping their idols. Jacob, all through his life, it's toward the very end that it says he finally took those idols and buried them in the ground. And that even all that time that God was helping him, he still had the idols, and he still had some affiliation with them. And they struggled with this even up to the time of Nehemiah, right toward the very end of the history of the Old Testament, that they are still being told to put away, in this instance, the wives that were leading them into idol worship. And so they always struggled with this. They always believed in God, but sort of also believed in other gods, and they weren't really sure. It would be kind of like today, for us, we don't tend to necessarily today believe in other gods. That's not so much our temptation. But don't we sometimes tend to believe perhaps that God is not real? I would say that probably most people in this room have struggled with that at some point in their life. Is God real or not? And so while they worried about whether there were other gods, we worry about whether there is a God. Or even if we don't worry about that, don't we tend to struggle with, am I really saved? Even if we know all of those things that we've been studying in 1 John, we still times really struggle with, I've messed up, and does that mean that I've lost myself? Is God really as good as he says he is? And so just like we struggle with those things, they really felt confused sometimes about whether or not there are idols. And so you want me to climb to the top of this mountain and tear down this idol? Well, what if that idol is real? And what if he stops me? What if he punishes me? What if he strikes my wife barren for doing it? What if he curses my land so it won't grow crops anymore for doing it? What if I get punished for tearing down that idol because they just weren't sure? They kind of believed in the boogeyman a little bit. And so he tells them they're tearing down the idols of lifeless things. You remember Psalm 115? In Psalm 115, he talks about how ridiculous it is to worship an idol. You go and you build yourself a wooden statue, and it can't breathe, it can't move, it can't see, it can't hear your prayers, it can't help you in any way. And the prophets were always trying to convince the people that was true. And so he sort of alludes to that. And he implies then that in every summit that you conquer, you have the power of the Creator behind you. In everything in life that you put behind you, that you tear down, because it threatens to pull you away from God. You have the power of the Creator, the one who made everything, behind you, as you pull those temptations down, as you get those things out of your life. You have the power of the Creator behind you. He continues then in verses 3 and 4, and he says that we have the Creator, the true helper, who watches our steps, our path. He says, he will not allow your foot to be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. And so you imagine if you're climbing a mountain, right, it's easy to slip. There's rocks and steep places, and it's easy to kind of step on something and slip back down the mountain. And so especially if you believe that there may be some God at the top who's against you, right, he's going to cause you to slip. He's going to cause you to fall. Later on in history, it seems like the Jews used these same songs that I believe probably Hezekiah wrote as a way of sort of worshiping on their way to Jerusalem to worship. And so the same thing, they'd be going over mountains and through valleys on their way to Jerusalem and feel concerned. that they're going to slip on the way and fall down into a cliff and never be able to climb out of it, that they're going to face these challenges. And so he says, don't forget who your God is. He's the one that will keep every step safe. Your foot will not be moved, because he who keeps you will not slumber. And so it's he who doesn't allow you to slip. The victory is not with the God on top of the mountain. The victory is with him. And it's he who always is alert, always aware. And that's the idea. He says he will not allow you to slumber. The word for slumber there is the idea of kind of nodding off. If you've ever been sitting, I see some of you do it right here in the pews pretty often. If you've ever been sitting and suddenly you kind of nod off, and that's the idea of you're trying to be alert, but the preacher's not as interesting as he thinks he is, and so you just sort of catch yourself. Oh, I didn't mean to fall asleep there. Well, he says God doesn't do that. God doesn't just nod off and think, oh, well, you slipped on that, and he meant to catch you, but he kind of nodded, and by the time you woke up, you'd already fallen to your death down below it. That doesn't happen to God. Second, he says, he who keeps Israel, who protects the entire nation, shall neither slumber, that's the same word, nor sleep. And so this is the idea of you're too tired to get up, right? You've laid down, and someone says, I need help, quick, and you just think, I'm so physically exhausted that even if I wanted to get up, I just couldn't. I'm too tired to do anything about it. And it reminds me, I think he's maybe making a kind of a slight allusion. Do you remember when Elijah was at Mount Carmel, and he had brought in the 400 prophets of Baal, and they had this great sort of battle, and where it was in that time of a drought, and so they poured water, and you think about what they did there. They're in a drought. Basically, they're saying, we're taking what little water we have left, and we're pouring it all over this altar to tell our God, we got nothing after this. We die of thirst without you. So do something about this, please. So they dumped the water all over Baal's, they're sincere believers, all over Baal's altar with the bull on it. And then it says that they pray and they shout and they cut themselves and they dance and they make fools of themselves. And Baal doesn't answer, and so after a while it says Elijah began to mock them, remember? And that he says, well, maybe he's on a trip, or it even implies there, maybe he's using the restroom, right? Your God is he's just gone to the bathroom, he'll be back in a little while. Or it says maybe even he's sleeping. Maybe he's just too tired to get up, and he hasn't heard you yet, he's just gone to sleep. Well, maybe that's the gods that were on top of the hilltops, but our God, he says, doesn't get too tired to get up. When he hears you call, he is always alert. He's always able to get up and to do whatever it is that you need him to do. And so in every summit that you conquer in this life, everything that you pull down that stands between you and God, every temptation that you pull down so that you don't have it in your life anymore, your path is made steady through the ever alert God. He's always there to keep your feet secure even as you are pulling those things down. He continues then in verses 5 and 6, and he says, the Lord is your keeper, the Lord is your shade at your right hand, the sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. And so he is our true helper who makes our path steady, but he's also our true helper who really protects kind of the environment around us. The dangers that surround us is kind of the idea. The space that's around you. It reminds me a lot of what Paul says in Philippians 4:19. If you remember in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 19, Paul says, now may our God and my God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. He knows what you need for your path, and that's discussed in Proverbs 16:9. You remember Proverbs 16:9 when he says that it's in a man's heart to make his plans, to direct his steps, but the Lord is the one who directs the steps. And so the idea of direct there is, it's literally the idea to set up. We put our foot forward somewhere. God establishes the ground beneath it to make sure that it goes to a good place. If we are, in Proverbs, following the wisdom of God, then as we make our plans and as we step out, he makes the ground firm so that we don't fall too far, so that we can always get back up and keep moving. And he always is able to do that and to protect even the environment that's around us so that we're not hurt by it. He says that the Lord is your shade at your right hand. Now, when you think right hand, what you're thinking, especially if you're right-handed, is your most reliable helper, right? Your right hand, if someone throws a ball at your face, what do you throw up? You throw up, or if you're left-handed, you do that. But generally, people are right-handed, and especially in ancient culture, if you were left-handed, they would train you to be right-handed because that's just, they thought of it as important. And so you throw your right hand up, right? If something's falling on your head, what do you throw up? You throw up your right hand. If you're going to do something and you're right-handed, odds are you're going to start with your right hand. Your right hand is the most reliable and constant helper that you have. It's what you turn to in moments of utility and in need. You turn to your right hand, and so that's why this concept is where the idea of a right-hand man comes from. It's the person that you turn to in all of your times of need or all of your times of utility, someone that you can always count on. But he says, our right-hand man, our right hand is the Lord. And he says something kind of funny. He says, he's the shade at your right hand. And that's the imagery kind of is, if you remember a long time ago, if you watched old movies, or women would have parasols, and they would cover themselves with shade when they would go out walking or something. Their right hand carried shade with them to protect their beautiful skin from the sun, And so that's kind of the idea. As they are climbing up this, as they're climbing these mountains, they feel afraid of the consequences of not having enough shade, of not having enough provision. Now, why would you need shade from the sun and the moon? Because notice he says, he's your shade, so that the sun will not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. There's two thoughts there. The first one is, it was a common thought in ancient times that the moon would strike you, that the moonlight had the ability to make you go crazy. And that's, even in very recent history, we would talk about things like moonstruck. The concept of, if you talk about a lunatic, comes from the word lunar, which means moon, that the moon could somehow make you crazy. Well, that was a common belief back then. And so they didn't want to be driven mad by the moon because they believed that was possible. But also, don't forget what Hezekiah and the people are doing. They are climbing these mountains to tear down idols. And what is two of the idols that the people of Israel seem to almost always be worshiping in the background? The sun god and the moon god. And Moses talks about it back in Deuteronomy. He says, when you go back and you begin to worship the sun and the moon, that's Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 19. It's just one of the places. And then even again, during the time of King Josiah's reign, which is the last, almost the last king of Israel, the last good one, we're told that they were again worshiping the sun god and the moon god. That really, if they were worshiping idols, that was always among the idols that they were worshiping. Well, if you're climbing a hilltop to tear down the altar of a sun god, then you feel concerned, if you're not sure if that's real or not, that he's going to strike you, that you're going to suffer for that. And likewise with the moon. And so he's basically saying, our God is your keeper. He's your shade from whatever you think those gods might do to you. He is bigger than them. He is more powerful than them. He is capable of keeping you safe. Even if you were climbing a mountain right to their very home to tear it down, our God is still capable of keeping you safe. Now that's an impressive God. That is a big chore. That is a difficult and hard task. But when you have such an impressive God, it's in some ways almost an easy task, isn't it? Doesn't it seem like that's how Caleb felt about it when he climbed the mountain and destroyed the giants that were on top of their fortress up on a mountaintop? That he says he almost seems like it's easy for him because he just knows God has commanded him to do it, and so God will provide the victory. And so he feels so certain about it that he says, somebody else could do this. And if they did, I would let them marry my daughter. And so he feels so certain that it's not even just him that's doing it. He knows that it's God that's doing it. He's the one that protects me. And so in every summit that you conquer, your space is shaded by the ever-present God. He's always there. He's always more powerful than whatever challenge that you were facing. He's always capable. Finally then, in verses 7 and 8, we have He is our true helper. He's a true helper of what you might say your heart or your soul. He says in verse 7, the Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth and even forevermore. And so that's, he says, specifically when you see, if you're using a translation that capitalizes Lord with the little caps, O-R-D little caps, it's a clue that he's using the name Yahweh there. Yahweh is the covenant name of God. And so he's reminding them, the God that we made a covenant with, the God that has made promises to us and that we have made promises to, if we are striving to keep our promises, he will not fail to preserve you. It says from all evil. Now, the idea of evil there is not necessarily, you think evil as someone that does harmful things intentionally. The idea of evil is really more, I think it could have been translated calamity, from all disaster, from all of the terrors that could happen to a person, especially if they're taking on such a terrifying task. He shall preserve you from all kinds of calamities. He's already talked about the calamity of falling off the mountain. He's talked about the calamity of being struck in some way by the sun or the moon. But now he just says generally, any calamity that you can think of, any problem that you imagine is going to happen to you as you were climbing up this mountain, anything that you think can happen, he can preserve you against it. In fact, he says, he shall preserve your life or your soul. And so he switches here really to more of a spiritual idea of this is more than he protects them physically. Whatever happens to them, he's always protecting them spiritually. And that's what we're the most concerned about. That even if we are going to face physical difficulty in this life, we know it's going to be worth it because on the other side, he's always protected us spiritually. And so he says that the Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in. And that's in that 2 Chronicles when he talks about them climbing the mountains to do this, 2 Chronicles 31. Verse 1 describes them doing that. Verse 2 describes that they went back and they really got all the things set up in the temple how it's supposed to be. And that's what they would do. The priests and the Levites would go in and come out of the temple, and they were doing that right without the high places. And the people especially in Ephraim and Manasseh, they would go into Jerusalem to worship and then go back to their homes. And as I said later in history, the people would come from the far corners of the earth, coming into Jerusalem and out to their homes. And wherever it is that you're going in and coming out from, wherever it is that you come from to worship God and go back to after you worship God, if that's what you're doing, and it says he preserves you from this time forth, and even, he says, forevermore. He is the keeper of my soul because I am faithful to him. And so he is faithful to me. For every summit that you conquer, your heart is guarded for eternity. There's never a time that God isn't protecting you when you are faithful to him. And so that's why the Hebrews writer, in very similar fashion, says, we boldly say, Hebrews 13:6, in Hebrews 13:6, he says, we boldly say, without doubt, without fear, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What could some God on top of a mountain, what could anybody do to me? Because he is our helper. He says he is our keeper. He is the shade at our right hand when things get too hot. He is our preserver. Whether 120 we're in the valley or 121 we find troubles on the mountaintop where we thought we wouldn't find troubles. Whether we're 2 Corinthians 4:8, hard pressed on every side. That's, Hezekiah should have been able to find blessings on the mountaintop, and he found more struggles. So in the valley and in the mountains, no matter what, he was hard pressed on every side. Sometimes I think we feel that very strongly. Hard pressed on every side. But he says in 2 Corinthians 5:7, that's okay, because we walk by faith and not by sight. We see what God is doing ultimately, eternally, and we just keep moving on. Even if it looks like something else is in control. Even if it seems like the boogeyman or whatever it is real. Even when it appears that things are not what they are. we walk by faith, even being hard pressed on every side, because God is always faithful. And so we say, the Lord is my helper, and nobody else. I depend on him. If we can help you to depend more fully on God, to see him and only him as your helper this evening, if there is some struggle that you would like us to turn to that God in prayer for, something that we can aid you in, comfort you through, please don't hesitate to come forward as we stand and as we sing.